2 hours ago, someone inside the National Security Council leaked a 34-page White House document to 4 major financial publications. The document, marked Eyes Only Senior Staff, was prepared during the first weeks of the administration. This isn't a scandal. It's not evidence of corruption or some backroom deal. Honestly, it's worse than either of those things. It's a strategy document built on one assumption, and that assumption was spectacularly wrong. Not reasonable people could disagree wrong. Wrong in a way that anyone who knew the first thing about Canadian history, Canadian politics, or the guy sitting in Ottawa's top job could have spotted before the ink was dry on the first executive order. Documents called Canada Compliance Framework, Pathway to Bilateral Realignment. 7 people wrote it. It's been driving American policy toward Canada for 18 months. Every screw-up that followed? It all flows from page 4. Page 4 contains a single paragraph that apparently seemed so obvious to its authors they didn't bother with supporting evidence, historical citations, or analytical justification. Here's what it says. Canadian governments have demonstrated across 5 decades of bilateral relations a consistent pattern of public resistance followed by private accommodation. Canadian political culture prioritizes the appearance of independence while accepting the functional requirements of economic integration with the United States. This pattern will hold under the current administration as it has held under all previous administrations. Timeline to compliance, 60-90 days. 60 to 90 days. That was their model, their plan. It's been 18 months. Look, the assumption on page 4 isn't completely insane. It's based on real history. There have been moments, plenty of them, when Canadian governments did exactly what page 4 describes. They pushed back publicly, then quietly accommodated. Softwood lumber disputes, the NAFTA renegotiation, Keystone Pipeline debates. Each time, what looked like Canadian resistance eventually became a bilateral arrangement Washington could live with. The 7 people who wrote page 4 looked at that history and decided it was a law of physics. It's not a law. It's a pattern. And patterns break when the conditions that created them change. 3 conditions changed. The document's authors missed all 3. Asterisk. The first missed condition. The man in the chair asterisk. Every Canadian Prime Minister who played the accommodation game described on page 4 was a politician first. They came up through party politics, constituency management, the accumulated compromises of a parliamentary career. When they faced American pressure, they calculated the political cost of resistance against the political cost of accommodation and, most of the time, found ways to look independent while accepting what Washington wanted. Mark Carney is not a politician first. He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England. He spent 20 years making decisions under pressure in environments where the cost of a wrong call wasn't a bad poll number. It was a financial crisis. He doesn't think in terms of managing appearances. He thinks in terms of structural outcomes. He doesn't calculate what's politically survivable. He calculates what's strategically correct and builds the infrastructure to execute it asterisk before asterisk the pressure arrives. The White House political team looked at Carney and saw a technocrat, someone without instincts for public confrontation, someone who'd prefer a quiet solution, someone who could be moved by the kind of sustained economic pressure that had moved every previous Canadian Prime Minister. What they saw was real. What they missed was the other half. Carney doesn't want confrontation, but he'd spent 14 months before the first major American escalation, building the infrastructure for exactly the response he'd need if confrontation got imposed on him anyway. The person least interested in a fight is sometimes the person most prepared for one, because they prepared precisely so the fight wouldn't be necessary. And when it became necessary anyway, the preparation was already done. The document's authors had no framework for this. Their model of Canadian prime ministers didn't include the variable. What if this one already built the exit architecture before we started applying pressure? Asterisk. The second missed condition, the world outside the room. Asterisk. Page 4's accommodation pattern was observed during a period when Canada's alternative economic relationships were way less developed than they are today. In the 1990s and 2000s, when the pattern was most consistent, Canadian trade was roughly 75% oriented toward the United States. The alternatives were theoretical. Redirecting Canadian supply chains toward Europe or Asia wasn't a realistic short-term option because the infrastructure, shipping capacity, regulatory frameworks, processing facilities, long-term contracts didn't exist at the required scale. The world changed. The document didn't account for it. 3 developments, running simultaneously over the past 5 years, transformed Canada's structural position in ways the compliance framework simply didn't model. First, the global critical minerals crisis. The world's largest economies, the EU, Japan, South Korea, India, spent the last 5 years in genuine panic about their dependence on Chinese and Russian sources for materials the green energy transition and advanced manufacturing require. Uranium, lithium, cobalt, nickel, potash. Canada has all of them in quantities that make it one of the most strategically valuable resource partners on Earth. The demand for Canadian supply was already intense before the current confrontation. Carney didn't create that demand. He walked into a room where every major economy was already competing to establish Canadian supply relationships, and he used the confrontation as the moment to sign deals. Second, the post-2022 European realignment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine drove European governments toward a fundamental reassessment of energy and supply chain dependencies. That created an institutional appetite for deeper partnerships with stable, democratic, rule-of-law resource partners, an appetite Canada was positioned to satisfy in ways no previous Canadian government had fully exploited. The compliance framework was written before this European realignment was visible. By the time it was being implemented, the geopolitical landscape it assumed had been replaced. Third, dollar confidence erosion. The document's financial leverage assumptions that American control over Canada's access to dollar-denominated markets would be decisive pressure were built on a model of dollar dominance that was already being quietly questioned by allied central banks. Canada's ability to activate euro and yen swap lines, to route trade through non-dollar frameworks, to present a compelling case to allied central banks for reserve diversification. None of this was modeled in a document that treated dollar access as an unconditional American instrument of pressure. The world the document described had already changed before the policy it produced was implemented. Asterisk, asterisk, the third missed condition, the Canadian public asterisk, asterisk. This is the miscalculation the document's authors understood least because it required not strategic analysis, but cultural literacy. Cultural literacy about Canada, that's something Washington has historically not invested in. Page 4's accommodation pattern worked in previous decades, partly because Canadian public opinion, while preferring independence in the abstract, was broadly pragmatic about the bilateral relationship. Canadians understood their economy was integrated with America's. They understood the costs of confrontation. They elected governments that reflected that understanding. The current confrontation changed Canadian public opinion in a way that has no precedent in the bilateral relationship's modern history. It didn't merely activate Canadian nationalism. Every trade dispute activates some Canadian nationalism. It activated Canadian identity . The polling from the past 18 months shows something Washington's political analysts had no model for. The more pressure the United States applied, the more unified Canadian public opinion became. Not just in opposition to specific American policies, but in support of Carney's specific, structural, long-term responses to those policies. Canadians who disagreed with Carney on domestic policy supported his response to American pressure. Canadians who'd voted for opposition parties rallied behind a prime minister they hadn't elected because what was being challenged wasn't his government. It was their country. The political coalition the compliance framework assumed would fracture under economic pressure. Provincial premiers worried about their economies, business leaders worried about their markets, opposition politicians looking for differentiation, never fractured. It consolidated. The document modeled an electorate that would pressure its government to accommodate. It encountered an electorate pressuring its government to hold. The report released 2 hours ago came with a 12-page analytical memo from the unidentified source who transmitted it. The analysis is precise and, in places, brutal. The memo's central argument, the compliance framework's core error, wasn't analytical. It was methodological. The document's authors asked the right question: what will Canada do under pressure? But they answered it by studying Canada's past behavior without asking whether the conditions that produced that behavior still existed. They assumed continuity. Everything that's happened since was a consequence of that assumption meeting a world that had moved on. The memo closes with a line that's already been cited in financial press briefings on 3 continents. A strategy is only as good as the assumptions it refuses to examine. Washington examined everything except the assumption it most needed to question, that Canada would be Canada as it had always been, because no one in the room had recently been to Canada. Mark Carney was asked about the leaked document at a brief corridor appearance this morning. He read the paragraph from page 4, the 60 to 90-day timeline, aloud. Then he put the paper down. I understand why they wrote that. It was a reasonable reading of the history. The history was accurate. The conclusion was wrong. Canada accommodated in the past because accommodation was rational. It stopped being rational. And when it stopped being rational, a different calculation became necessary. He paused. We did the different calculation. We've been doing it for 14 months. He picked up the paper and walked back into his office.